We're investigating an extremely volatile and fast-moving subject today. The question of the Arab uprisings in North Africa. That's where the most advanced of those uprisings have taken place. And today, for the first time, we are joined by colleagues from North Africa itself. We have Clement Henry in Cairo, and we have Robert Parks in Oran, Algeria, to join us in a discussion of the latest developments. And I think given the location of these two visiting speakers, we're able not just to talk about the three cases that we're all familiar with so far, namely Tunisia, Egypt, and now Libya, but to look a little bit farther across the North African region. And that's why I think it's quite good that we've sort of bracketed North Africa with a representative, an observer from Cairo at one end and from Algeria toward the other end. What we will do today is begin with our two speakers from far away. We'll start with Professor Henry, and we'll move on to Professor Parks, and then we will come back to Singapore and hear some comments and discussion from my colleague Robert Bianchi and myself before we turn the floor over to members of the audience. Let me just say a word about our two speakers. Clement Henry is one of the most prominent and distinguished political scientists working on the Middle East. North Africa has been his particular area of focus within the Middle East. He wrote a very excellent book on politics in North Africa some time ago. He also wrote on Tunisia. He has been following North African affairs, particularly Tunisia, very closely for a very long time. And of course now he is in Cairo. Clement Henry recently retired from a long and successful career at the University of Texas in Austin, and he is now embarked on a short-term appointment as chair of the political science department at the American University in Cairo. He has worked on the politics of international oil, banking systems in the Islamic Mediterranean countries, the development of civil society in the Arab world, and lately, in collaboration with Robert Springborg, has written a very fine and pithy political economy of the Middle East. So we're really glad to get his observations. Our second speaker will be Dr. Robert Parks, who is the director of the Centre d'études maghrébines in Algeria, based in Oran. He is the director of this center, which is owned by, it's an affiliate of the American Institute for Maghreb Studies, whose mission is to facilitate scientific research on North Africa. So he's been resident in Algeria for a while, and will give us, I think, some perspectives on not only on recent developments in Libya, as well as Tunisia and Egypt, but also perhaps will address the question, very interesting question, of contagion and spillover. And that, indeed, is the subtitle of our discussion today. Are there other dominoes possibly to fall in North Africa? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Clement Henry. And the floor, Clement, is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's really great to be back in Asia virtually and just come from Korea. And I'm delighted to have a chance to, continue to be perhaps virtually jet lagged only by an hour rather than 7 hours. Delighted to be in contact, and I hope someday to visit you in Singapore. Now, what has struck me about the Arab Spring has been that the first two flowers to break out into bloom are countries that I've always considered to be twins. Tunisia and Egypt, if you look at their histories, they tried to modernize and develop new states in pre-colonial times. They were then occupied at roughly the same time, 1881, the Egyptians by the Brits and the Tunisians by the French. They achieved real independence at about the same time, in that the fictitious independence of Egypt after 1922 really became solid and substantial only with the advent of Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952 and his successful political self-defense, the Suez War of 1956, which was the year that Tunisia became independent. Now, these states, since independence, have also followed relatively similar trajectories, playing with state socialism for a while in the 60s, and stepping back from that toward readjustment, moving to market economies in the 1970s and 80s, and developing also economic command and control systems, their banking systems, in relatively parallel fashion, heavily state-owned, and yet with a sufficient private sector, and at the same time funding private sectors to a much greater extent than some of the other military regimes in the neighborhood, such as Algeria, Libya, Syria, and Iraq, which all remained heavily state-controlled economies with very weak private sectors. Well, what does all this mean? Basically, the Tunisians and Egyptians had much more developed states than their neighbors, with the exception of Morocco, which I don't have time to go into this morning. And they were able to have military forces and other aspects of the state bureaucracy that were relatively independent of social forces, tribes, family, clans, connections. I mean, personal connections always played a role, of course, but you really had standing bureaucracies, often with histories dating back to the mid-19th century. So all this meant that when, for various economic as well as political reasons, mass protests began, there was an army back there that was not about to fire on the demonstrators. In fact, in the case of Tunisia, one can argue that it was really this relatively apolitical army determined not to shoot against fellow Tunisians that spelled the victory for the demonstrators, who over the period, as you know, of 20 days or so managed to topple the dictator Ben Ali. I won't go into the causes of the revolt so much as the consequences. The causes, well, yes, Tunisia had engaged in a police state that corruption was highly centralized in the hands of Ben Ali and his wife, and all this eventually made waves, and coupled with the increased unemployment of graduates, various grievances which fueled this uprising. There were differences between the Egyptian and the Tunisian uprising in that the Tunisian one started in the periphery of the country, whereas the Egyptian one was always centered on Cairo and Tahrir Square. But despite the basic similarities, I mean, Egypt even went one better than Tunisia once Tunisia toppled its dictator and was able to get rid of Mubarak, I think, in only 18 days rather than 20-some days. But the subsequent development, I think, shows basically very different systems within these basically similar economic profiles. The differences in particular concern the army, the Islamists, and basically the political class of people. In the case of Tunisia, the army had been marginalized. It was not the favorite of Ben Ali. Ben Ali himself was a military officer, but in an intelligence, and he based his power not on the army, but on the police. The army was sort of the stepchild, which was basically American trained and kept in the background. Whereas the Egyptian army, the army of Gamal Abdel Nasser, always maintained a premier role, even if it no longer appeared to be ruling, since the ministers, the governors, tended now to be drawing more from civilian rather than military careers. But the army always had a political role since 1952, and it would continue to have one, a major one today. The Islamists also, seems to me, are rather different. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, as you know, was founded in 1928 in Egypt. The Islamists in Tunisia, after 1970, forming as a response, as a reaction to an overly sort of Frenchified, Gallicized political elite. The Nahda party of Tunisia nevertheless was conditioned by the consensus that had emerged during the struggle for independence, where the Tunisian nationalists, themselves valiant Muslims, Mujahideen, the head of them, Bourguiba, the Mujahid al-Akbar, the supreme combatant, these people had forged a synthesis with French culture, which made for an authentically Tunisian national French as well as Arab Islamic understanding of the world. And it seems to me that Ghannouchi and company inherited, they operated within this context, and today they are not, for instance, seriously questioning things like the laws against polygamy and various other progressive legislation that the Tunisians were able to enact. It seems to me this is a very different story from Egypt, where you have not had a similar sort of evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood. To be sure, the Muslim Brotherhood is very complex. There are moderate elements, but there are also other elements, and it seems to me that this is an organization which does not have the, has not yet demonstrated the commitment to a civil society and a relative, well, I won't say separation of politics and religion, but an understanding that religion, for instance, is not going to threaten things like tourism, personal aspects of life. In Egypt, the situation is much more ambiguous than in Tunisia. But thirdly, the political class. It seems to me that after the uprising and the toppling of Ben Ali, you had a situation that, of course, was very fluid. Transitional governments, by definition, do not have legitimacy. But the Tunisians managed first to take the president of the National Assembly and put him in as the provisional president, a fellow who, nice to all people and not willing to rock the boat, but who in the end showed a certain wisdom in some of the decisions he made. Because after the first prime minister, an apolitical technocrat, but who had served Ben Ali for a long time, just was so discredited by the angry masses that some change had to be made, a new prime minister was appointed who came out of the Bourguiba era generation, a fellow 85 years old, Beji Caid Sipsi, who had only operated under the Ben Ali regime for the first 2 or 3 years and was not discredited by the various excesses subsequently of that regime. Anyway, he was able to steer a course to elections. But even more interesting, it seems to me, was a kind of a fabricated transitional council that started out as a technical body of constitutional reform and gradually extended itself, adding NGOs, adding trade union personalities, becoming a kind of a representative of civil society, which was able to basically backstop the various reforms needed to carry out free and fair elections. And these, as you know, happened a few weeks ago and have resulted in a substantial plurality for the Islamists, for the Nahda party. We have yet to see how this will work itself out. The Constituent Assembly has yet to meet. But the point is that they did all this in quite an orderly, creative way, creating as they went along, and they were able to muddle through to elections, which I think everybody has agreed on are legitimate. Now, meanwhile in Egypt, the army, rather than this civilian transitional council, and took charge, the Supreme Council of the Air Force, of the Armed Forces, and they have not really performed in ways that have, moved the country in a transparent way toward free and fair elections. There's some question as to, how long is the military going to stay? The elections themselves are a protracted affair, supposed to begin this week, but which, will then drag on. First the National Assembly, and then the second House. This will all take, through March, and then, maybe in April something will meet. But meanwhile, the Army is trying to even define the rules whereby the Constitution will be made. And the basic problem here is that the military, unlike the Tunisian military, has a huge number of vested interests. It's very important in the country's economic life. It's utterly untransparent. It's a state within a state. And the revolutionaries wish to gain some control over what is going on. They wish to have a say. They wish to be able to subject the military to a civilian control. All this, by the declaration of principles of the Constitution that the Deputy Prime Minister has recently drafted, becomes impossible. We are set for serious trouble. Friday, a week from this coming Friday, in other words, in 8 days' time, there will be a big demonstration in Tahrir, where the Muslim Brotherhood and the more extremist Salafi elements, the Party of Light, are trying to organize a demonstration against the army, against this declaration of principles by the provisional government. The liberals are in a completely embarrassed situation. They realize that the army is their protector. They see in the Tunisian successive Nahda, oops, the same thing happening, perhaps on a much worse scale, in Egypt, where, again, the liberal forces are relatively unorganized, and the Muslim Brotherhood is extremely well organized and is expected to win big in elections. The elections themselves have been rigged so that you have two sorts. It's a more complex electoral law than the Tunisian proportional representation, in which you have single member constituencies side by side with proportional representation in Egypt. But still, basically, the outlook, once the Egyptians heard what happened in Tunisia, they are fearing greatly the potential of new elections. The army has, meanwhile, managed to antagonize a lot of people by maintaining a very rough rule of law, putting troublemakers into jail, trying them in military courts. There are even cases of alleged torture, and all of this does not bode well for the Arab Spring in Egypt. There's a real challenge. Maybe just as the Tunisians, in starting the Arab Spring, they were able to conquer that first fear that people had of security forces. There were so many Tunisians demonstrating that finally they gave up their fear. And this example traveled to Egypt, where, again, the Egyptians, massed in Tahrir, gave up any fear of the police and indeed succeeded in defending themselves against thugs who were trying to undermine the revolution. The question today is whether the second big fear of the Islamist bogeyman, whether the Tunisians can overcome this second fear of the liberals vis-a-vis the Nahda. If they can do it in Tunisia, the further question arises whether this can be contagious, whether this second fear can be overcome in the more complex and frankly less promising situation of Egypt. Well, there's no point yet in trying to make predictions, but let us keep our eyes on Tunisia and hope that they're able to begin this second struggle for consolidating democracy by conquering the fear of Islamists. I think I'll stop here and hand it over to Bobby, who, coming from Algeria, is in a sense, maybe they've anticipated something of what is going on in Egypt. In Egypt, the liberals seem to be basically unhappily having to, not support the Muslim Brotherhood in those demonstrations next week, and they may indeed end up very much like the situation in Algeria, where it was the military finally that took over, using again this fear of Islamism as the excuse to maintain their power. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Clem. And now I think we'll move directly to Professor Parks.
It's great to be, like Clem said, virtually back in Asia. So today I'm going to talk about Algeria and the Arab Spring. Algeria is sort of kind of the lodestar case for what's happening within the Arab Spring. People constantly look at Algeria and its earlier experience during the 1990s, when the single-party regime collapsed and a sort of plural sort of party regime was put into place, and elections were held, and political Islamist section won the elections. The elections subsequently were canceled, the military took over, and Algeria broke out a civil war, which cost an estimated 200,000 lives. And so on the one hand, people are looking at Algeria saying, look, you know, we should pay attention to this case to try to understand what's happening perhaps in Egypt or in Tunisia or elsewhere. On the other hand, people are also saying that Algeria is somehow immune. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so just to anticipate my final conclusions, I will say that I do not think that Algeria in the short term is going to be affected by the contagion of the first stage of the Arab Spring, which is regime change. However, I think that Algeria will be affected by the second stage, which are the transitions. And so Algerians are going to be paying very close attention to what's happening in Egypt and in Tunisia. See if they're actually coping. So let's go back to December and January 2010, 2011. Like in Tunisia, Algeria erupted into massive riots. Riots spread throughout the country. All of the northern wilaya or states were affected by riots, which lasted five to today, depending on the locality. And these riots were very sort of riots, just angry people within the city, usually in the poor neighborhoods. And they're usually bread and butter type issues. People, they're in housing, better housing arrangement, people demanding paved roads, people demanding increased subsidies on basic foodstuffs, people demanding that the government stop its aim to crack down on the informal sector. These riots in January didn't turn into something that was political initially. Instead, they fizzled out, and as they fizzled out, lo and behold, Ben Ali is toppled for political reasons in Tunisia next door. So in February, a group of civil society and political parties got together and decided that they were going to create sort of a democratization council and organize a series of meetings or series of rallies on every Saturday to protest the regime and to call for greater liberalization. So you have riots occurring in January that fizzle out. You have a 2-week period where there's nothing happening. And then in February, you have political parties and civil society getting together and saying, we're going to organize mass protests and hopefully overthrow this regime. Well, what happened is those riots, those demonstrations actually fizzled out. They were somewhat popular in February, less popular in March, even less popular in April, and by May, they were just non-existent. And so the question is sort of, why were these economic demonstrations and riots that are in January not able to transform themselves into some sort of political demand for greater change, as we saw actually in Tunisia? We call it the Tunisian Arab Spring, the Jasmine Revolution initially began, or at least in part, due to sort of economic grievances, but then spun out of control into something that was much greater and surpassed something simply economic. So the question is why this didn't happen in Algeria. And I would suggest there are a number of reasons, both domestic and sort of related to international relations. One, Algeria is not quite like the other regions and the other regimes or the other states that have been affected by the Spring. If we look closely at the cases, Libya, Tunisia, to a certain degree Egypt, certainly Syria, these are extremely hard regimes that are noteworthy for their ferociousness to their people. There are also regimes dominated by families or single figures who've been powerful very close. And Algeria is not quite like that. Algeria is a hybrid regime predicated on a very divided political elite that has a multi-party system where political parties represent different identity-based politics, or Islamists, or Berberists, or perhaps nationalists. But it's a fairly open system.
With French and European interests that focus primarily on economic factors rather than on military factors.
Okay.
What did I stop there?
Okay. Who showed well go first?
Whoever can hear me.
Is Bobby Parks still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Should I
I'm glad we can't see you, but we're glad we can hear you.
Yeah.
So let's just decide who goes first.
How about Parks? Yeah.
Hi. Yes. It's a good question of why we exist. Why we exist? Regime. The question I'm often confronted with is, what is the Algerian regime? In Tunisia, dégage been in Egypt, dégage Mubarak. Who has to dégage in Algeria for there to be change? For there to be how many people have to dégage? It's certainly not just the president. It's certainly not just the military. So the question is, and I think Algerians want the same questions. Dégage qui, right? Who has to dégage? Who has to leave for regime change? And people start thinking about that. And it's an entire system that has to go, and they just don't know how to go about doing it. And perhaps that is part and parcel of this hybrid regime that they have. They complicated things so much. So many veto players within the system that it's not clear which veto one needs to remove in order for greater democratic reform or liberalization. And I think that's just a short and dirty answer.
Okay, Clement, do you want to give a fuller and cleaner answer about Egypt?
You asked me whether the role of the military in Egypt is leading to a revolutionary situation. And I guess my response to that is that Egypt does appear to be running sort of Algeria 1990s in slow motion, in the sense that liberals may well now be kind of not supporting, being scared of the Muslim Brotherhood, may accept the idea of continued military rule for a while despite their unhappinesses. But on the other hand, Egypt is no Algeria. Egypt is a real state. Egypt has a long history as a state. It has basically law and order prevail. People, except maybe in parts of Upper Egypt occasionally, don't run off and take arms. It's a more subtle system in which I think the military and the secular forces can watch the Muslim Brotherhood gradually be pulled to more extremes by the Salafis. Or if that doesn't happen, they could indeed coagulate and work together against the military. That is, it's not as frozen a situation as was Algeria in 1991-92. There's still a lot more flexibility there. And as for revolution, they've talked a lot about revolution here, the revolution of what was it, the 25th of January. Where's the revolution? I've seen a lot of, I've heard a lot about it's almost like a Manfred Halpert new middle class youth making sort of an uprising, but having a maximum of about 25% of the vote if the referendum of March was any indication, where the liberals were, really lost in a major way, and the military won its game of reforming the Constitution at the time. So, no, there would be a revolutionary situation in Egypt if we could see some action going on in the countryside, something to reverse the reversal of the agrarian reform in the 90s by the Mubarak regime, which, Nasser had introduced, Sadat had partially reversed, but the full reversal came with the market economy and the emergence of small but substantial landowners. I mean, there could be an agrarian reform, there could be villages mobilized, but I haven't seen any of that happen.
Good. Now, let me ask you about coalitions. What's your sense today about what would be required for the liberals and the Ikhwan to paper over their differences and work together to press the military to have a more rapid and faithful democratic transition?
I think that there has to be within the Muslim Brotherhood, within the Freedom and Justice Party, a real division such that a part of it takes a strong position, for instance, against what happened a couple of weeks ago, the Maspero incident, where the army mowed down a bunch of peaceful Coptic demonstrators. And, some 24 of them were killed, and the public media were saying that they had been shooting at the military and getting their just reserves. This was absolutely outrageous. We didn't hear anything from the Muslim Brotherhood, protesting and nothing of that sort. So, if they took more positions, very clearly in favor of the historic, Muslim Copt revolution of 1919 and all of that, and if there were sufficiently substantial portion of them, the well-organized professional elements, then yes, I'd see real prospects for democracy developing in Egypt. I'm waiting for that to happen, but I've been here for a couple of months and I don't claim to be an expert on the inner workings of the Egyptian politics, but it doesn't seem yet to be apparent. And I know that liberals were very disappointed with the Muslim Brotherhood's lack of response to the Maspero incident of October 9th.
So you think the ball is in the Brotherhood's court? The ball is in the Brotherhood's court. It's for them to make the initiative.
I think that they have to learn a little bit from their young Tunisian brothers about, systematically trying to put at ease various elements in Tunisian society, especially the minorities, the Copts. But, also
is there
very large segment of moderate Muslim opinion that doesn't go along with this sort of narcissistic mixture of religion and politics, and Islam is the solution sort of stuff.
Is there any chance that the Brotherhood in Egypt will be receptive to advice from Turkish colleagues in that regard?
Well, Bobby, that's a very good question, because, Erdogan came to, he did his pilgrimage to his old Ottoman domains, first Tunis, where he was welcomed royally. So royally, in fact, the Tunisian authorities were scared and put him at a separate airport so that the welcome wouldn't be too visible. Then he came to Egypt, where I'm afraid the Muslim Brotherhood were very unhappy about his affirmation of the secular republic, and said as much. So as far as these Muslim brothers are concerned, the Turkish experience, the AK Party, all that is just not part of the game they want to play. They have a better idea of what Islam is all about than anything these Turks can teach them.
Great, thank you. Not everybody is educable, I guess. Then let me ask both of you about Libya. What do you see ahead in terms of forming a transitional government and moving to democratic alternatives there? Given the importance of American and European intervention in the Civil War phase, and both sides working together, do you have any questions or any concerns that American and European interests now might begin to diverge and that this will complicate things going forward?
Well, of course, the state, I guess, is more, the fight against the mythical Qaeda of the Maghreb, and will Libya join in, where the Americans already have had a pretty good working relationship with the Algerians as well as the Moroccans. I don't know. It seems there, though, that Bobby will know more than I, but the French and the Americans seem to be working reasonably well together.
Yeah, I think, for the French, they definitely need a stable government, whether it's sort of a new democratic government or something else. And so, I don't see much divergence right now. Right now, the key is just stabilize the country. You can't get lucrative oil contracts if you actually can't get access to the grain. The one thing I think that we're not really quite aware of, but what are different groups that would form a pro-democratic coalition? From everything I'm reading and I'm seeing, and we had the pleasure of speaking with Herb Vanderwall, the big Libya specialist recently in Korea, it looks like Libya is splitting into micro-militia, and sort of even in Tripoli, sort of Herb Vanderwall was saying, but when he flies into Tripoli, sort of the one thing they're always worried about are these different militias that are actually fighting around the airport, and you have to wait for different militias to stop fighting so the airplanes can actually land. Libya is turning into sort of a smash and loot process where people are appropriating property that was used to belong to political people. I think it's just too early to even talk about a pro-democratic coalition. What we have right now is a continuity of the Civil War, where instead of two groups, like the opposition versus Gaddafi, got now all of these militias picking up arms and sort of trying to assert their own position. So it will be important to see how the U.S. and Europeans actually go about trying to get these different militias to disarm and to enter a negotiation process. But everything I hear so far is that it's just real chaos.
This sounds like a deadlock in Libya. The militias say they won't turn over their arms until there's movement toward democracy. And the people who are running the show are trying to say that they can't move toward democracy until there's some kind of disarmament. So
yeah.
Is this a Mexican standoff or a Libyan standoff? Libyan version of it?
Clement?
Yeah. Things are sort of blanking out here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Go ahead, Bobby. You got it.
Well, in many ways it is. Sort of the people in charge say that we can't do anything until the militias disarm. The militias won't disarm until they see real progress. But yeah, I think that this is you have really divided political elite now, and this notion that this is the time to these young men who have taken up this to seize material goods. And I think that picture that seems to be increasingly emerging is that it's just going to be sort of standoff until some sort of group can come in and force either those claiming to represent Libyan revolution, these militias, so kind of represent the Libyan revolution. In many ways, it's like Algeria in 1962. In August of 1962, only there are probably 4 armed groups involved in the classification, which have an 8-year struggle against an enemy you had just sort of covered just a few months. So maybe I just think too early even to talk about. We just don't know enough about what's happening in Libya.
Yeah, maybe they're not done fighting yet, because this isn't about this isn't an argument about how to proceed toward elections and drafting a constitution. It's an argument about who's on top, who's the boss.
Exactly. And as well as the proliferation of small armed groups, it's going to be difficult there's going to have to be more of a monopolization or oligarchy of armed groups.
Okay. Let me ask you something else then about Tunisia. Both of you are talking about the fear of Islamic takeovers and intolerance, and the early news out of Tunisia is that the Tunisians have elected Larry Summers and Milton Friedman as their new government. In other words, Ennahda is talking about the economy. They want to promote foreign investment. They are talking about things that are music to the ears of Clement. Bank mergers, easier listings on the stock exchange, convertible currencies, increasing, he's getting excited, you see? Increasing foreign investment in tourism. Okay, Clem, are you ready for this one? Islamic finance. Wait. I didn't get my question yet. My question is, what's there to be worried about? What's the Islamic boogeyman? There's nothing left. If what we're getting is the World Bank wrapped up in green, then who cares what happened in Algeria in 1992? And who cares about what people think about the Ikhwan's real intentions and so on? In other words, is there really any reason to think that there is going to be any learning from reality, whether that reality comes from Tunisia or from Turkey or Indonesia or Malaysia or anywhere else? Isn't it obvious that there are examples, abundant examples, all over the place, of Islamic democracy and capitalism going hand in hand, and that if Egyptians and Algerians want to continue their fear, they are going to do it for their own reasons, and they have ample reasons to continue that fear, regardless of what's going on next door or anywhere else.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You know, 1 million Algerians a year visit Tunisia. Algerians, I think, after the French, are the #1 tourists in Tunisia. So as Tunisia moves along, if Ennahda is able to organize this transition in a very effective and efficient way, promoting economic growth, protecting sort of secular interests, yes, that will certainly change the perception of Algerians as they go to a quote-unquote green Tunisia, and see that it actually works. And the question is how that's going to affect the Algerians. Are they going to look toward their own Islam parties? Will new Islamist parties come out of the woodwork? Will they have to rethink how they do politicalism? So I think that the long effects of this Arab Spring, if Ennahda works out in Tunisia, will have an effective impact in Algeria. Will change radically the way they view political Islam. Simply because there's so much exchange going on, at least for the tourists, between the two countries. So, yeah, so it's not, I don't think that Algeria, if Tunisia works out, is going to continue to have this worldview of sort of the 1988 riots and then the Civil War. I think things will change.
Great. Clem?
Well, I'm delighted you noticed how the stock market is doing in Tunisia. It makes me want to sort of move from the Skype and take a look at what the latest numbers are in Egypt. But it looks to me as though Egypt is still pretty much rock bottom. But I have to check that out. I think this second fear we talk about, the fear of the Islamist bogeyman, one way that could be kind of curtailed, brought under control, would be if our graduate from Guantanamo in Libya actually gets control of the various militias, puts them into a standing army, makes law and order, and cooperates with the Americans in the war against Qaeda. This would be quite a pleasant surprise. And I wouldn't, dismiss the possibility. But that still leaves us with a lot of baggage in Egypt, which I think the Egyptians are going to have to sort out for themselves. They are almost impervious to things happening around them. Egypt is the center of the world. Little Tunisia, it doesn't really matter. Syria, all these other places, they don't really matter. So if the Egyptians are able, within their own confines, to carve out a coalition between elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, which they've tried to do in the past. I mean, there have been various parties that have formed out of it, but they would have to somehow get the Muslim Brotherhood apparatus, which is a substantial organization, and get it behind them, marching in a more, what shall I say, tolerant, Catholic with a small c direction.
Yeah. These are great answers. First of all, you're telling me, Clem, you made my day by telling me that Guantanamo is going to be seen in most retrospect as a finishing school for moderate Islamic leaders. That's great. And,
right, that's what the Libyan was saying. That's all.
And Parks is telling me that people can actually learn from their neighbors about Islam. You don't have to look all the way to Indonesia and so on. And Clem is telling me that Egyptians are really just, too pleased with themselves to be that interested in anybody else, including, if they're not going to listen to the Turks, what do they care about the Tunisians, right? So that is surprising, because it's telling me that Algeria looks more fluid and flexible right now, and the conventional wisdom is the opposite. And Clem, on the other hand, is telling me that Egypt really looks stuck because of the Ikhwan, and that doesn't really jive with my understanding going into things, which is that Egypt is a much more fluid and complex society, and that the possibilities for alliance formation are more numerous, and it just takes a little bit of imagination or internal revolt and generational friction for all of these groups to very suddenly change their views of one another and their idea of who their friends and enemies are. And I'm a little concerned about Clem's view of the Ikhwan, and I'm going to push you on this one, because you're talking about the Ikhwan as though it's a unitary actor, and we know better than that. And they're, the more open they become, and the closer they get to having any kind of public security and respectability and political position, the more they fragment, the more their dirty laundry comes out in public, and the more they split. So, isn't that good news? They become more pluralistic.
I think you all are painting a much too optimistic picture of this whole situation. It seems to me that when you look at the short-term and maybe medium-term economic consequences of the uprising in all of these places, the news is bad. And when the news is bad, it seems to me that this gives opportunities for more extreme, more ideological, more radical elements among Muslim groups to come to dominate. And I would have thought that the situation in Egypt is particularly worrisome, and that you will see possibly the Turkish model that is relevant is not the Turkish model of Erdogan. It may turn out to be the Turkish model prior to Erdogan, when there was a huge rift between an extremist Islamist movement and secular types. And I'm wondering if this seeming coalition between the Muslim Brothers and the military is really all that durable if you've got a lot of social and economic distress. I would have thought in Libya, you know, instead of the graduate of Guantanamo might turn out actually not to have been so happy with his experience in Guantanamo, and that the Islamists might prove to be the glue that begins to cement together all these fragmented militias. And that leaves the Nahda in Tunisia, assuming that they really are as benign as Ghanouchi lets us believe, as being sort of the softies. And I don't know about Algeria, but Bob Parks perhaps could tell us a little bit about whether the social conditions of Algeria are such that you could actually see a revival enhanced perhaps by this demonstration effect of things happening to the east, of the kind of nastiness that occurred back in 1991 and 92. And that leaves the country that we haven't even talked about at all, and maybe we don't have time, which is Morocco. And the question there is, I suppose, whether the rentier effect or the presumed buffer effect of monarchies as institutions would really save the kind of social malaise that Morocco suffers from leading to political instability. But I'd be interested in comments from Bob and Clem as to whether a darker scenario is not possible for the whole region.
Okay. Well, I think that the social conditions in Algeria now probably aren't that conducive to much. 70 up to 70% of non-hydrocarbon economy is informal sector. And people are increasingly withdrawn from politics, as we saw in February when the political administration was made by people. So they're certainly not buying into the political parties and the society groups that exist out there, increasingly withdrawn. And so a good indication of this in the riots that occurred in Syria last year. There were 10,000 riots in Algeria, which to me seems to indicate that political parties and civil society groups that exist now are no longer able to articulate. So, whereas I'm optimistic that perhaps Tunisian model can change people's vision of politics and how Islamists can behave in politics, and maybe people have the politics vision that they've had up here over the last 20 years. The social conditions are vague, and we don't really know what's happening on the ground because everything is informal.
Well, the dark scenario that Mike is asking about certainly is possible, and to paint it a little more, first, in Egypt, the way things are going, the Muslim Brotherhood seems to be becoming more factors may also further push in the wrong direction. It's for Libya, it may be like Algeria of 1962, where it takes quite a struggle to disarm those different militias. And that in turn, will not lead to a very happy transition of any sort. It could get very messy in Libya. But I think I have to agree with Bobby that for Algeria, going back to the 1990s does not seem to be in the cards. And also remember that Algeria has very substantial oil and gas revenues and is proceeding to distribute them, so that it does kind of manage to well, as one author said, manage instability, and so it keeps going, but there will inevitably be new faces. The question is whether the new faces that occupy the presidency and that occupy certain top military positions, whether it will simply be a change of faces, or can we also imagine a change of system? The difficulty with imagining a change of system is that there is so little sort of cooperative activity, so little ability to engage in collective action. It all tends to be more spontaneous, tire burning and interest articulation through spectacular means rather than sustained organization.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Bobby. You there?
Hello?
Yeah?
Yes, I'm back. Yeah, so where did I cut out? I cut out at some point and I didn't realize.
The connection's been a little bit choppy, but I think we got mostly what you said. What I'd like to do now is open up the discussion to our participants here in Singapore, and I'm going to ask Ramel to give us instructions as to how people who would like to make comments or ask questions to our participants where you should stand and what microphone you should use. So.
I'll control the microphone.
Okay. And if you would introduce yourself, and I hope that Ramel can our participants see Mohammed?
Yes. I am a Yemeni Arab Singapore citizen. I would like to give an Arab perspective of the whole discussion that's going on today. The miseries in the Arab world is the result of failed economic policies, just like what we are seeing in America and Europe and other places. What we all have been talking about, I want to highlight about the first thing, the organic civil uprising, which you call the Arab Spring. I would like to also highlight the Islamophobia, the fear of Islamic parties dominating in the Middle East. And thirdly, I would like to assure everybody here, whether we're discussing the problems in America or Europe or there's no quick fix. There's no solution by flicking the switch. In fact, in some ways, we are blessed. You have just mentioned, one of the speakers mentioned that we are blessed with oil. We have a very good income, but we have a problem of depletion of water resources. But everybody is thinking for the first time. There's no reversal to the despotism of the war. The ugly truth, the delay was because the West has been supporting the despots until they became monsters. Until Libya, after 42 years of Libyan Gaddafi rule, left a wasteland. There's hardly any civil society. There's hardly any institutions. Not even an army is relying on his machineries like Muhammad Ali and all of the others. So this is the reality of the situation. The point I want to make here finally is that the gloomers and the doomers will be disappointed because there is a political will in the Middle East. I agree with Professor Clement that Cairo is the pivotal center of the Arab world, and whatever happens in Cairo will have a contagion effect on all the other. But the development now in the Middle East is not even. Yemen is still very backward, and Libya is a wasteland, but we have got the means to import, to inject expertise from outside. They will be able to. The point is, everybody is thinking in the Middle East. Nobody wants to go back to the old days of despotism. So that is a positive step forward. I'm very optimistic in this sense. But to those who are gloomers and doomers, let me lift their sinking feeling a bit. Where it happened before, that the Arabs can think, now we have got internet discussions going on. We have got the international experts discussing with the population. We have got the NGOs making a very good contribution, whether it's in Egypt or it's in Tunisia. But of course in Yemen is to much lesser degree because it's not so developed. But on the whole, I'm very, in fact, there is similarity between this organic uprising in the Middle East with the Occupy movement in America. And the present turmoil in Europe, which we are seeing almost the death of Euro and the disintegration of the European Union, is all a major problem, even worse than our problems. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more comments here in the audience, and then I'll ask you to respond to the collective comments or questions that are coming out here. And maybe we can ask Nasri.
Hi, I'm Nasri from the Middle East Institute. I just want to talk about the situation in Egypt, and I want to bring about the idea of another actor in the shaping of the political Islam scene, and that's the Al-Azhar University. And the Sheikhul Azhar, Ahmad Al-Taib, for example, has brought out, in June, I think, an 11-page declaration of how the future of political Islam should be. And in this declaration, he kind of, repudiated the idea of an Islamic state, but at the same time also said that the source of law should be the Sharia. So there's a kind of ambiguity over there. And my question really is this really a kind of progressive third that is reflective of the movement or the sentiments of the masses, or is it Al-Taib trying to move away from his reputation as a Hosni Mubarak stooge? That's my first question. And the second one is how is his or Al-Azhar stand being received, and if it is received, and how will it shape the political Islam in Egypt and then in the wider North African region?
Okay, so if there's one more question or comment, yes, Fahad, please.
Hi, Fahad from the Middle East Institute. I want to return to the Islamic boogeyman scenario, or the Islamist boogeyman scenario, and particularly Al-Nafha. Clement, you mentioned about the fact that if their action and their rhetorics coincide, they may set a model for Islamic political being that might kind of assuage some of the fears that people have about the Islamists. But I'm wondering, to what degree can we actually clump Islamists together and say that Nafha is the same as Ikhwan, or is the same as some of the different Salafi manifestations? So basically, I'd just like to get a sense from you of whether or not you think, if they do, in fact, show that they are somewhat moderate, that can actually be assumed to be replicated in other places.
Okay, would either of you like to respond to any of those comments or questions?
Yeah, I just would like to quickly, and then I'll let Clement answer the questions seem to be more oriented toward Egypt, but I think that in Algeria, it's not the Egyptian model. People aren't going to be looking at Egypt. They're going to be looking at Tunisia. Egypt, for the Algerian people, is too far away, and there's too much bad history between the two countries. Tunisia will be the model that people will be looking at. Algerians go to Tunisia, Tunisia comes to Algeria. It's got a long history, sort of a political history, but also in Islam, it's been sort of a Muslim intellectual history shared between the two countries. And this goes back to the 19th century with the Salafi Islam movements. And so it's Tunisia for Africa, not Egypt. I don't think anyone is optimistic or even really cares about what's happening in Cairo, here in Algiers so far. So.
And don't forget the Turks, who I think would also be as welcome in Algeria as in Tunisia, and probably also in Morocco. We haven't talked about the Peace and Justice Party of Morocco, Justice and Development Party in Morocco, but again, here is a moderate movement that may be further reinforced by Nahda. So I agree that the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt are not at the center of the universe, only of that part of the Arab world that they find most significant, which is themselves, plus the Mashriq, that is the Levant, plus the Gulf, where money comes from. That's basically the Arab world is seen for Cairo. Now, the first gentleman was optimistic. I can't quite hear very well what the question was, but I think that, you know, there's cause for optimism in the long run, in that surely new voices have been heard, a new generation that had been left out. I mean, the striking thing about all of these regimes, it seems to me, is their utter inability to bring in the young people, whether it's political parties or regimes. In fact, the governments often have younger ministers and so forth than political parties are able to, you know, renovate themselves. You have aging leaderships in all of these countries, and I think the Arab Spring, you know, largely was a response to that. That said, that means also that there is a certain critical mass that all of these regimes have been developing over the last half century of, you know, ever more educated, critical people. Now, actually, Arab education is very, shall we say, underdeveloped compared to educational systems in your neighborhood. But they have a long ways to go. But the fact remains that you do have young people who have the latest sort of thought and instruments, and this is a long-run check, it seems to me, on utterly arbitrary behavior of arrogant powers that until now have felt that they could rule just without listening to anybody. I guess the question about the wider impact of the Egyptian experience has already been answered. I think also this whole issue of differences within Islamist movements really is it's a function of political context. It's partly a function of the country in which an Islamist movement operates, but even more, as we see in Egypt in all its complexity, the contexts as they change. If we move back to a more repressive regime, that will reinforce the more extremist elements and more of this association between the wide-eyed, crazy Salafists who apparently want to go back to the 8th century and 7th century, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is represented in these demonstrations that are supposed to happen on Friday, the 18th of November. Now, again, maybe Tunisia will be the beacon of hope here, although Tunisians themselves are very afraid that the Secretary General, who spent years in prison and is rumored to be the next Prime Minister, he's very moderate, but that some of the other guys are, you know, there are even some Salafis in the background there, and Nada says one thing to Western audiences and another thing to their own people, and selective quotations can be found to kindle the fears. So I'm not saying that even Tunisia necessarily is a clear-cut case of success, but it does have more than any other. This will simply take Tunisia back to what it always used to consider itself to be, sort of the pioneer experience of the region. And let us see, I think that surely there are grounds for optimism, not just in the long run of a new kind of youth, that does happen by definition, generation to generation, but also really structural change that develops sort of consolidated democracy, good governance, responsive militaries, and other good things. But the Tunisians still have a lot of problems ahead. Reforming the police is not easy, and of course it's much harder in other countries like Egypt, where, you know, 8 times as many people and 10 times as many police. You know, you've got real problems here. I'll leave it at that.
What is most disturbing?
Excuse me, Clem, did you want to say anything about Al-Azhar? Nazri's question.
About what?
About Al-Azhar.
About Al-Azhar, well...
He was asking about the influence of the Sheikh Al-Azhar.
I missed that question. What has interested me most recently, though, has been not with the Sheikh of Azhar, but rather the Mufti of Egypt arguing against some crazy Salafi. What was the argument about? I can't even remember. But the Mufti is taking a very basically liberal line versus what he views as a very archaic, tired, obsolete notion of Islam. The Mufti is quite a progressive individual. Within Al-Azhar, oh yes, the argument actually concerns the Ash'ari cosmology. I mean, these are medieval issues still, but they cover very modern themes sometimes, and as in this particular debate that I was reading about just a couple of days ago in the press, which the questioner may have had in mind, but was asking about Al-Azhar.
Okay, I think that's very helpful.
Can I have a follow-up?
No, I'm sorry. I'd like to let everybody else have a chance first, please.
Yes, I have a follow-up question.
Okay, but let's hear from other people, and then we'll get back to you.
And can I just throw something in real quick?
Yes.
What I think is so interesting about Tunisia is, and maybe Clement, you can sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, Jama Zitoun or Kairouan, which are the historical institutes of Islamic learning in Tunisia, played virtually no role in the transition. This is many reasons they were demobilized from the Bourguiba Ali, but they have political Islam based on party politics in Tunisia, not on correct?
I got one little footnote to that, which is that the dynamo behind this transitional quasi-parliament that really put things together is the son of the Fadl Ben Ashur, who was the Sheikh of Zitouna. But the son, of course, was a law professor, modern, French-style, Tunisian, secular law. and actually had no political experience, but his Tunis background, his Tunis breeding, his connections, I'm sure did help put this whole thing together, working with another old Tunisois leader, the Prime Minister, and another old Tunisois, the President.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I've got two questions. First, a general question. I've got two questions. First, a general question. Is the Arab Spring a political development or an economic development? The second question is a little bit more specific. We have considered the army and the religious constituencies, and also the unemployment factor. My question is, do you agree that other important considerations are the elite versus the others, and also the elite versus the others divide, and the youth versus the others divide? The two divides.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there another comment or question from anybody who has not yet spoken? Okay, Matt, please.
Hi, I'm Matt from MEI, from Middle East Institute, sorry. So I just had a question about, well, I've heard this term civil state often used by the Muslim Brotherhood, which seems to be some sort of loose adaptation of the Turkish model, whereby even though the state would have an Islamic character, it would respect essential civil liberties and civil rights and respect the rights of women and minorities. But on the other hand, it seems like the Muslim Brotherhood sort of became more hardline in some respects recently in terms of how they repudiated Erdogan when he visited and urged Egypt to adopt a secular constitution along the line of Turkey. So I just want to know what, if I could ask you to sort of unpack this civil state concept and whether or not it conforms to a more liberal version of Islam or something else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Talib? Yes. You need the microphone.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
This question is for Professor Clement. What is most disturbing is that most of the academics and the pundits never ever criticize the extreme form of Sharia law in Saudi Arabia as practiced by that repressive regime. But when it comes to other countries in the Middle East who are about to embark on a possibility of having Islamic government, they become hysterical and they become paranoid. This is hypocritical. I as an Arab, I want to reflect the feelings of most of the Arab people in this sense. Can you answer my question, please?
Okay, let's turn it back to our two speakers. Who would like to, we've had three comments here, who would like to respond? Bobby Parks will start.
Well, I think the one thing that we see, we certainly saw in Tunisia, and part of this isn't economic, but you know, sort of economic reasons has to give political dimension for people to get up to protest next to regime change. So you know, it's clearly both. Just being hungry or being angry that you don't have a job doesn't necessarily lead to regime change or mass movements. Look at how you get 10,000 riots, but you don't have large protests against the regime. And so there is clearly a political element that has to go in beyond just the economic component. Economic disgruntlement can trigger something, but there has to be something else working before. So, well, then I think I'll just stop there. Clement?
I'm having a very hard time hearing the questions. The last one concerned hypocrisy. I'm not sure, I got the word hypocrisy, but I didn't get the context.
I'm very disturbed, very disturbed.
Would you like to elaborate?
I will rephrase my question again. I often hear a lot of criticism about the fear of Islamic Brotherhood or the Sharia law taking over in the upcoming countries like Tunis and Egypt and Libya and so on. But nobody commented, nobody criticized or condemned the repressive regime of Saudi Arabia, where they have an extreme form of Sharia law. Some of them are misinterpreted. They're draconic in some ways. The West doesn't seem to be disturbed. They seem to be comfortable. They seem to be at home. Why? Because Saudi Arabia has oil? This is the hypocrisy I want you to answer.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to answer that a little more pointedly. If you look at American and Western reactions to the one little Arab Spring that a very fine bunch of people in Bahrain tried, and the result of Saudi tanks running over the causeway and destroying that uprising. That's the quick answer to your question. There is indeed a lot of hypocrisy about this Arab Spring. A lot of, I think, genuine unhappiness in the American foreign policy establishment, where it's clearly understood, yes, we have to stand by Saudi Arabia because that's where the oil comes from, and we're responsible as sort of the leaders of the world to ensure the full free supply of oil to Singapore and beyond.
Especially to Singapore.
Thank you for your technique.
Yeah. There was one other point. Sorry.
You're so painfully right, and I thank you for that question.
Thank you.
I have a hard time hearing things, you know.
There was
the civil state. This is, this civil state rhetoric is part of the principles in this 22 article draft put out the Deputy Prime Minister. And I don't think that per se is a bone of contention, but we'll see, you know. I guess one little hope for Egypt might be, you know, once you get through all this business of haggling over the principles and get down and they do the vote and they get their constituent, you know, the committee drawn from the new parliament to write the constitution, there may then be all sorts of arguments which could enable a split to develop between kind of moderate democratic Muslim brothers and their liberal friends, isolating the more extreme elements. That's possible. Anything, I think, is possible with this Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but it's much less predictable, I think, than the Tunisians, where there is a genuine commitment on the part of Nafta to democracy. Now, I must confess, for the first speaker, I could get a few words about youth and elite and privatization, but I'm not quite sure what the question was, and it's just, I have a very hard time hearing the combination of acoustics and accents and stuff. But so maybe just one simple sentence could be repeated to me that will give me the quick clue as to what was said, or maybe
No. There were two questions. One, I think, has already been dealt with, and that's whether the Arab Spring is essentially driven by economic or by political motives. But the other comment, I think, was quite interesting. It had to do with, if I can interpret, as to what extent these uprisings can be identified as being associated as elitist as opposed to mass-based, as youth-based as opposed to old people based, things like that.
I think that's very good. It's a good question, and I think the answers are, well, obviously a little bit of both, but to elaborate a little bit on that, I do see a difference between the Tunisian backing and the Egyptian backing. In Tunisia, remember, it starts out in a peripheral area, and it's people feeling sympathy for really downtrodden, sort of would-be educated youth, sort of unemployed people. And here you get definitely, it's a mass phenomenon which the elite picks up on. And you have a convergence of, on the one hand, very simple economic needs and the resentment of the arrogance of the local authorities. The Hogra, the arrogance, the example of a policewoman in Sidi Bouzid slapping the youth, whether indeed she did that or not. But that you know, that hits a popular mass bell. But on the other hand, you have these extravagant stories of Lila, the wife of Ben Ali, and all the terrible sort of economic things that were going on. By the way, corruption got really serious toward the end, because I was talking with the governor of the central bank back in June, a good fellow who was brought in, who was managing the Tunisian economy very well. And he pointed out that it wasn't so much the bad debts that they were accumulating, but rather the rate of increase of debts that the Trabelsi, Ben Ali people were accumulating over the last 2 years, as they were getting really big things. They were buying into banks. They were buying into major strategic assets. Anyway, all of that became sort of, that was the talking point of, you know, every family in Tunis. I mean, the massive corruption over the past 2 years became really just the chitter-chatter of Tunis. So you combine those two, and that produces a real revolution. In Egypt, on the other hand, it seems to me that the poor people are kind of dragged along, but that we're talking about really a much more sort of, you know, young bloggers, people who are people whom the middle classes can identify with, but old as well as young, because you come out with, you know, the professional syndicates and other, you know, the lawyers, the judges, all these other people escalated under Mubarak who out in public. So it becomes mass as well as youth, but it remains pretty much an urban phenomenon. At least that's as far as we know. Maybe it's partly because Jazeera couldn't quite get out into the countryside, but I think that there is much less of a popular mass rural element to the Egyptian Spring. And then you move it to Libya. Well, Libya, everybody's involved, one way or another, because they're all members of one family or another. They're all pitted against each other. No intermediaries, no political parties, no pressure groups, no trade unions, no nothing. Just families, blood, reimagined tribalism. Tribes don't exist either, but you've got to reimagine something for any sort of collective activity. And there you have it, everybody's involved. It's mass, but revolution, I don't know.
Okay, we're getting near the end. I'd like Bobby to have a
I'm sorry, can I just add something in about this generation class of what happened or what did not happen in Algeria? Is that sort of what we saw in Algeria when the political protests actually began is we saw people from the second generation of post-independent elites, not those people who led the country to independence, but this second category who's dominated, at least symbolically, politics over the last 20 years, the Islamists and the Berberists. And in January, Ali Belhaj, the number 2 of the former Islamic Salvation Front, was the party that sort of won the elections in 1991, tried to organize protesters, rioters, into a large demonstration. And he was actually lapidated by the youth in Awad. In February, Saeed Sadi, who represents the Berberist wing of this second generation identity politics, was not able to get people out to protest with him. And sort of as Saturday after Saturday after Saturday progressed, the people who showed up went from 2,000 to 1,500 to 500. So at the end of the protest, when he finally called the protest off, he was ridiculed as being Said Samdi instead of Said Sadi. Samdi in French means Saturday, so they're calling him Said Saturday, sort of in a joke. And so you've really got this sort of monopolization the last 20 years of the second generation, which seems to have demobilized this generation, meaning children or young folks who were born in the late 1980s or certainly the decade after the 1990s. So you don't have this sort of multi-generational component on it out there you might elsewhere.
That's fascinating. I'm going to, we've come pretty much to the end of our time, but I'm going to ask Bob Bianchi to say a few words at the end, and then I think it will be time to adjourn.
Well, one thing that strikes me is the proliferation of models in which Islam is a part. We have Tunisia as being a pioneer in its area. We have Egypt being a pioneer, at least in its imagination. We have Turkey being a pioneer of good things and bad things. And then, of course, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to reach to Indonesia and Malaysia, which are also pretty thriving democracies and capitalist societies. Who knows, maybe even Pakistan will get back on the map in terms of Islamic democratic politics one of these days. The point here is that the more models there are out there, the more Muslims have to debate, and the more they argue in public about these things. I think the more they allow other people to become more relaxed, because their debates are going to sound familiar, and they're going to fit in with other debates that are going on. And the idea that there's a monolithic threat, I think, will recede. So I'm very impressed by that. The other thing is that this business about Saudi Arabia being the magnet that sucks in all evil, especially from Washington, is a fascinating idea. But you know what? I'm very impressed at the degree to which Beijing is not sucked in by that same evil, even though they are highly, I would say equally and increasingly dependent upon that same oil and then upon those same regimes. But you know, from Beijing, they see the Americans losing control of the whole region and responding potentially by diving back into it in an even more calamitous manner. That the Americans say they want to get out, but everybody really fears they're going to jump back in a way that is going to make it 100 times worse. And the Chinese reaction to this is to stand back and hedge all of their bets. So the Iranians are coming to Beijing, the Saudis are going to Beijing, the Israelis are going to Beijing, and the Chinese are saying, we're delighted to see you, and you know, we're going to invite you to a banquet, and they're just seeing their enemies out the back door, you know? And the Chinese are saying in the meantime, you know, this Middle East, it's always been an American sphere of influence, and they never did a great job of it before, and we're just going to sort of sit on the sidelines and let them screw themselves a little bit more in the next few years, and then maybe we'll pick up the pieces, if there are any left.
Well, on that cheery note, I think this has been despite the occasional glitches with the communications, I think this has been a fascinating session, and I really would like to express our collective appreciation to Bobby Parks and to Clement Henry for so much enlightenment about the clearly rather complicated and confusing, if not contradictory, developments that are occurring all the way across North Africa, from Egypt, perhaps all the way even to Morocco. So it's been very good, and I think we should give them a round of applause. So we'll say thank you and good morning, I guess. For us, it's time to adjourn for
Almost lunchtime for us now.
Oh, sorry? Lunchtime. Almost lunchtime. Almost lunchtime. Well, it's almost time here in Singapore for some refreshments. So we will adjourn. Thank you, and we'll say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Hope to do this again. Yeah.
Good afternoon.